Hello and welcome to another episode of Copper's Corner podcast. My name is Copper Kelly and I'm your host. And this week I'm joined by the songwriter Colm Gavin, all the way from Dublin. Say hello, Colm. How are you doing?
Hey, Copper. Thanks so much for having me.
Not at all. Thanks very much for coming on. And Colm has actually suggested that we talk about Elvis Costello today. Funnily enough, we had Elvis Presley last week. We have Elvis Costello this week, or as we say here in Wexford, Elvis Costello. I don't know if you hear that up in Dublin at all. Do you ever hear that pronunciation, Costello?
Yeah. I had a couple of Costello neighbours. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. But yeah, if you want to dive into the life and times of Elvis Costello, I'll probably end up saying Costello at some point, but forgive me if I'm wrong. It's like the Gallagher, the Oasis, Gallagher and Gallagher.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, if you want to follow the podcast, you can go to Facebook, Instagram as Copper's Corner Podcast. You can also help support the show on Patreon. It's patreon.com/Copper's Corner. And Colm, where can people find you if they want to find your music, your socials, and so on?
So Facebook, Colm Gavin Music, and Instagram, Colm Gavin are usually the two go-tos. I have Twitter, but I don't use Twitter. So
yeah, like myself.
Yeah. It's for me,
there,
it's kind of like it's the men's bathroom wall of the internet. So I tend to stick to the other two. But yeah, Instagram or Facebook probably the best.
Exactly, good stuff. But yeah, Colm, before we dive into Elvis Costello, tell us about yourself. You're a singer-songwriter from Dublin, and you released an EP recently. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah. So my most recent release, the 1992 tapes, came out on the 13th of August, and it's 5 tracks. It's just myself on piano, and there's no other arrangement apart from that. So it's as solo a solo record as you could possibly get. And it was recorded with Brian O'Dwyer and Alan Thornton from Thornton Pianos. Christmas of 2020, I did a thing called the Superior Sessions, which Alan and some of his gang put together at Thornton Pianos. And I was just so taken with the quality of the recordings and the superb instruments. They have a wide collection of Rit Mueller pianos. They're actually the Rit Mueller ambassadors of Europe. And Rit Mueller pianos are available all around the world. Yeah. They do
These are big brand, I'm assuming, are they?
Yeah, it would kind of like, I said the German equivalent to Steinway. It's probably the best way to put it to you. And
right.
far less expensive than Steinway too, but the quality is, if you could put one beside the other, you'd find it very difficult to tell the other apart.
Yes.
And so I had in my mind for a while to do kind of like a songbook EP and just pick random songs of mine that I had flying about in my head, or maybe a new arrangement of an older tune, and just throw it together in an EP and bring it out. But that was like a lot of things with me. It was just kind of pipe dreamy for a while, and then the opportunity came to work with the guys, and so I leapt at it. A program that you've been on before, the Jeff Pulver show, the week of or the night before the launch, we had kind of a launch party, and my boss Tim Jarvis from Bio Records was on chatting, and we had performances from Emily Sangder and Brian and Alan came up to chat about the record. So it was just lovely, and the response has been insane. Like, it got to number 56 in the Billboard 100 in the States, which is the first time that's ever happened to me. 81 in Italy, and number 1 here in the singer-songwriter charts and 4 in the pop charts.
Wow.
So
congrats. That must be a great feeling altogether to chart regardless. Where are you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like we talked before we went live here. If there's even a handful of people listening, that's great. And then when something is widely received, especially in non-English speaking countries, like with Italy, and one of the singles was number 2 in Japan. It's always interesting because
you're going to be big in Japan, so
well, yeah. Well, I just that blows my mind. Like, we're both musicians, and everybody starts listening to their Walkman or Discman at night, and hoping that the guys that you're listening to you could maybe emulate someday, and then that starts to happen a little bit. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you started off busking on the streets of Dublin, and we did appear on a past podcast of mine, Folk Around podcast. You came on and as a guest, and we went through your history in good depth, I suppose you could say. Yeah. But just a quick rundown for those that might not have heard that podcast. So I suppose you started on the busking on the streets, and then you went to start writing with Charlie McGett again. Do you want to tell
Well, no,
that?
there's a big jump between those two things.
Big jump now, but do you want to tell that bit of the story there?
I'll synopsize it as much as I can. Yeah, my musical education was kind of twofold in that a lot of it was done busking on the streets of Dublin, but also I studied through the classical method with the great Peter Stanton. Now, the busking side of it, I started busking in the summer of 2007. I think I was 15. When I say that, because now 2007, like people are there's teenagers who weren't born in 2007.
Born, yeah.
So I started busking. How it happened was completely accidental. Anyone who's familiar with inner city Dublin will know Central Bank was kind of a meeting point for teenagers at that time, usually rockers, emos and rockers, and all sorts of mixed and varied cultural people alike. And we would meet up on the weekends. I was with a few friends and I brought in my acoustic guitar and we were kind of sitting around just chilling. There was about 10 or 12 of us. And the big song of that summer was Hey There Delilah by the Plain White T's. And I was kind of picking my way through it and sort of half singing it. And some tourists passed by and threw money into the bag. And two of the girls I was with said, "You should do that. You should go and bust." I'd never
like,
heard.
"Oh, come back, you dropped something."
Yeah, basically, yeah. I thought they were trying to throw it at me, like, shut up. But two of the girls I was with said, "You should do this. You should go into town and you should busk. That's something that you should think about doing." So that summer, I would go into the square in Temple Bar, and I used to play outside the Eager Beaver. And I would do that like
great name
intermittently every like 2 or 3 days. And it was partly terrifying and it was educational, but the biggest lesson in it was I was making money from music. And it wasn't always a lot of money. Like you might make €10 over 3 hours. Some days you might make 30 or 40. But the money, it wasn't about how much money it was, but that money would go to buy me like a can of Coke and maybe a new CD.
Yeah. And
that for me was enough. It was adding to the fervor and the fire that was already in me of a love of music. And that I busked from about 15, like intermittently until I was about 21. So about 6 years all in all, with a couple of breaks in between. And like on the one hand, people often say, would you, if your son or daughter or whatever came to you and said, "I want to go busking," would you be straight away like, "Yeah, no problem, that's cool, I think you should do that"? Or would you have some sort of trepidation? And what I would say to anybody, especially a younger person now starting out, and there's buskers as young as 12 and 13 on Grafton Street, is it's very different today, because when you are going through a PA system or a small PA system, which I didn't do, you create a community around you because you're loud enough that whether you're saying the national anthem or you're singing a Britney Spears song, it's going to attract people. And that creates kind of like a little semicircle of people.
Yeah.
And, there's good and bad in everything, but you'll always have a little tribe who will kind of look after you. When you don't have that, you're not as inclined to get big groups of people stopping for a long period of time, unless you're just exceptional. So when I started, it was very much passing trade. Like it was someone who, I played on South King Street a lot. So someone who was coming up from, say, Zara or H&M, heard you, recognized the song, reached in their pocket, put money in the bag. You would create crowds from time, but that's much easier to do when you're amplified. So when you're isolated for a long period of time, you have to deal with every kind of person. You have to deal with the geriatric who's telling you you're too loud, deal with the groups of young lads and young ones who are,
"Oh, I know this song. Can I get your guitar for a minute? I'll play this." Like, no,
which I never did. I would never give my guitar over to somebody else. There was one time that a group of tourists wanted to get a picture of me, and one guy wanted to hold the guitar. And as the flash went, he let go of it. And since I still have the guitar, and it still has this massive crack on the face of it, he just dropped it like that. And that was the one and only time I ever let someone hold my guitar. But yeah, that's the only bit of advice I would give, is that it kind of turns you a little bit cynical, because if you're doing it and this is your only source of income, then you're banking on it. And what I've learned with music is, if you're doing it for anything other than the love of it, it's going to be a nightmare for you. Like if you're doing it to make ends meet, every gig you have will be the worst gig you do. If you're busking because you need the money to buy your partner a birthday present, it's going to rain that day, or the guards are going to move you on. So like I found that whatever you do, even if it is your livelihood, try to stay really close to the thing that you love the most about it. And then every gig's a good gig. Every jam session's a great jam session, and so on.
That's it. It's like the old saying, sure, if you do something you love, you never work a day in your life. So that's kind of
yeah. But the problem with that is,
in a way. But
yeah, kind of. But at the same time, you don't want it to turn into a 10-year party, which for some people it does. And then
there's that too. Yeah. You have to.
It's a fine line, Copper. It's a fine line, and like I lived it. You know, when I was busking with some amazing musicians, and unfortunately with some of them, that culture of like, if you build up a bag full of money, or if you do a great gig, just got paid, every night feels like someone's birthday party. And then you wake up 8 o'clock the next morning in someone's apartment, and you don't know where you are. You pull yourself together and you go out and you go busking again. And that turns into a cycle that there's no upshot from. Yeah. So you kind of have to know where the graduation stages are. And at 21, I just made the decision that I was done with that chapter, and now it's go on to something different.
Yeah. So you went on. Yeah. So I suppose there's a lot going on as well, but you did start a songwriting partnership with Charlie McGettigan over the lockdown. Wasn't that right? Charlie McGettigan being the Eurovision
supposed to be called a legend now at this stage.
Yes.
Which he is.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're saying that it came about, you're texting each other or something like that. You're all over text. Is that right?
When I brought out my first album, A Voice for the Urban Darlings with Bio Records, Charlie, on his program on Shannon's Side on Saturday mornings, he used to play songs from it from time to time. Oh, yeah. That was a huge compliment to me, because the name Charlie McGettigan in my house was just synonymous with, well, great music first and foremost, but like kind of a legendary status of having won the Eurovision for the 3 in a row with Ireland, but also songs he'd written for Maura O'Connell and just a whole heap of other reasons. And he sent me a message at the very beginning of lockdown, around March or April of 2020, and he said, if you'd be up for it, it'd be great to write some songs together. Now, what I thought would be like 5 or 6 songs turned into 60 over the course of a year. And we have plans for a number of those songs at the moment, which I won't say too much about. Now, I hate when people say, I have this big news, but I can't tell you, but I genuinely can't in this instance. But believe me, I would. Charlie was amazing. And like I had said to you before, he's encyclopedic when it comes to musical knowledge, but it kind of taught me, he would pitch you like a ragtime idea or like a kind of a 1920s halftime shuffle type idea, and you just have to think on your feet, because I noticed with him, if you let it go longer than 2 days and then send him the reply, he kind of already like dismissed it and then moved on to the next thing. So you needed to learn to collaborate at quite a fast rate, but that's an education in and of itself.
Yeah. I suppose since I was talking to you last, you performed in the Bord Gosh Theatre at one point. I remember seeing the pictures of that. It looked fantastic. Like, what was that? Was that to an empty audience?
Unfortunately,
it was. That was the drawback of it. But at the same time, you were still on that stage playing. That was a big grand piano, wasn't it? And you were.
That's right. Again, that was kind of part of the Superior Sessions thing that we did with the gang from Thornton Pianos. But that gig was intended to be in front of a live audience, and I know the guys have similar intentions to do something in an even bigger venue. But the beauty of that was the production element of it. Like he had a huge film crew who were amazing, and it was intense. Like people don't realize how hot those lamps are, and then when you're playing and you're sweating, and but it was lovely. I think it was the backdrop was quite poignant of having a completely empty theatre. Yeah. It being the largest fully seated theatre in Ireland, and that really, for me, like when I look back on 2020, that's what it summed up. There's a lot of musicians together and nobody there to be able to watch in person, which thankfully now is coming to an end.
Opening back up slowly but surely, but we're getting there. But I suppose let's have a look at the reason that we're here chatting today. Mr. Elvis Costello. I'm going to do that.
I knew you'd do it once.
Elvis Costello. And of course, this is not the same guy as Elvis Presley that we were talking about last week. This is an English-born singer-songwriter. And he's, did you actually, his real name?
Declan McManus.
That's it, Declan Patrick McManus. And he was born the 25th of August, 1954 in Paddington in London, in England. And so his father was Ross, or Ronald McManus, sorry. And he was born in 1927, and his mother was a record store manager, Lillian Alda Ablett, born in Liverpool in 1927. So his father was a band leader, and the mother was a record store manager. So he came into a very musical family straight away, which definitely helped influence him. I know myself, I didn't really come into a music family at all. Were you born into a music family? Or
No. I mean, not in the sense like Elvis what would have been. Like mom and dad were interested in music, but they wouldn't. Neither of them played instruments, and asking them how you would have got into the music business would have been as alien as saying, how do you join NASA? You know, like, and not to their detriment. Like, how would you know, if you weren't involved with it in some way, shape, or form?
Exactly.
But sometimes just being exposed to good music is enough. It'll light a fire in you. You'll pursue it whatever way you choose to.
That's it. But yeah, Elvis, or Declan at this point still, he has some Irish ancestry. I suppose you can go by the name McManus and Costello, as we will see. His grandfather was John McManus, who was from County Tyrone, Northern Irish. He moved to England, and he was killed on an accident on the dockside in Birkenhead, where he worked. And Patrick's mother, Patrick being Declan or Elvis's father, was Elizabeth Costello. She didn't survive much longer after that. So Patrick, Elvis's father, was shipped off to an orphanage in Southall with his brothers, where they all learned to play musical instruments. Patrick, Elvis's father, later ended up in the British Army in Ireland, and he was shot in 1917 by some Irish people, I'm assuming. It doesn't go into much detail here. But he recovered and went on to play jazz on a luxury transatlantic cruise ships, two of them called Georgic and the Majestic, up until 1933. So straight off the bat, there was a lot of family history there. Did you know about this side of the things at all?
Not that far back. I knew his dad was involved in the Joe Loss Orchestra, and there's actually some great footage of him singing "If I Had a Hammer" from what I imagine would have been the 60s. It was mid 1960s, and he's the image of Elvis. And and he has a book. He had an autobiography he released a couple of years ago, which goes into great detail about the records that his dad would have had to listen to in the house, because they would learn the hits of the day. So he would have, like songs like Trini Lopez's "If I Had a Hammer," or like "Eve of Destruction," that kind of the hits of the day, I guess.
Yeah. And actually listened to an interview with Elvis recently there, and he was saying how, he grew up in a house, there's all the records were playing. His mother constantly bringing home records from the store, and he had all these records that had access to all the stuff that his friends just didn't have. And he obviously helped influence his taste in music. But also, I think at one point, his father was doing a gig that included the Beatles in the lineup. And he brought young Elvis, or Declan at the time, along with him. And Elvis goes, "Oh, Dad, will you get me the autographs of the lads there, will you?" And so he did. And the Beatles each signed their name on one blank piece of paper. But Elvis, he was asked in this interview, "Do you still have it?" And he's, "Oh, I do. But at the time, I cut it up in 4 sections to put into my little autograph book. But now I've since learned that it'd be worth a hell of a lot more money if it was all on the one page." Imagine that. But so he was definitely in the thick of it from a very early age.
Big time.
Yeah, and actually he goes on later in his career to start a kind of a songwriting duo with Paul McCartney himself.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. But basically he started off when he was in 1969. He started his first public appearance, let's say, at a folk club in Richmond called the Hanging Lamp. And before that, he had kind of, school bands, I suppose you could say, throughout his school time. But apparently, he wasn't a great student. He was an average student, like myself. I don't know about yourself, but he was average.
Below average, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. So when he finished school in mid 72, he neither the ambition or the qualifications to do anything but music. And so applying for every job he'd thought of, he wound up getting a job as a computer operator for Midland
For
Bank.
Avon, was it? Oh, Midland Bank, yeah.
Yeah, well, Midland Bank here says, yeah.
Yeah, I think he ends up working for Avon at some point. The beauty product.
Beauty products. Oh, I was wondering. Okay.
I think so.
Yeah, so he was in this bank. In this, he was like maintaining mainframes, and it took little supervision, and he just kind of gave him a lot of free time. So he was there writing songs and stuff while he did that. Apparently, it wasn't a fantastically high-paying job to begin with, but it kind of kept him going, I suppose. But this is before the time he started to work with Stiff Records, and I think he came on as a songwriter at first, but they basically said, "Hey, we'll get you on as an actual recording artist, and we will record you singing the songs." And they were saying to him, "Oh, look, you have to give up the day job and come back with us full time." And he was thinking, "Oh, look, I have a day job, but it's not paying a huge amount, but at the same time, it's guaranteed. What can you do for me?" And they basically said, "Look, we'll give you a bit of an advance." So they gave him a bit of advance anyway, and with that, he'd be able to quit the job. And he got himself a little battery-powered guitar amp. And I think on that little battery-powered guitar amp, he wrote "Watching the Detectives."
Wow.
Yeah. I suppose, are you very familiar with his very early stuff? I suppose Alison was his second single. Less Than Zero was his first single.
That's right. Yeah.
Obviously, Alison is probably one of his most famous songs.
Will probably be one of his most well known. Yeah, My Aim Is True, I think, was 1977, I think. And like, I remember here, like, funny enough, the band that's on that isn't The Attraction. And
that's right.
I can't think of the names now, but they went on to become part of Huey Lewis and the News.
That's right. Yeah, that's true.
I think. And they get a lot of flack. Like, when you listen to Alison, what I've seen it reviewed as previously was they have all the charm of a pub band that, for something as sensitive as Alison, maybe it was lacking that sentimental touch. I love the original recording of Alison, and I feel like anytime he's tried to twist it or like redo it over the years, it never matches the charm of the first rendition. And maybe that's just me, but I like it. It was a heck of a debut, you know, when you think about it. And some of those early tunes, like, I remember picking up a compilation years ago that had "Angels Want to Wear My Red Shoes." And there's a fantastic line in the second verse that goes, "I said, I'm so happy I could die. She said, drop dead and left with another guy." And I think for any teenager hearing those lyrics for the first time, you can just totally hone in on that. And I think he was like, he was very angsty. And I remember reading a quote one time that he said, my whole goal in life is to be an irritant. And I love that about him. That early sort of punchy, passive-aggressive type lyric. And it's all through like radio, any of that kind of stuff. And that certainly drew me into him to begin with. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. And it's at this time as well when there was this famous SNL or Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, Saturday Night Live. Yeah.
They were actually, Costello and the band were a kind of a last minute substitute for the Sex Pistols, who were due to come on, and they had agreed that they would play Less Than Zero, but I think he played the first four chords or something like that, and then he goes, "No, we're not going to play that. We're going to play Radio instead," which was more controversial. I haven't actually heard this song myself now. What's Radio about? I'm guessing it's
Radio is kind of like how would you explain it? That top 20 radio at the time was geared towards your typical top 50 pop music, and that the people who someone like Costello would have felt were making genuine work. Like, if the 1970s was ever going to produce a second Beatles, then we were never going to hear about radio. He uses the word anesthetize, which I don't think I've ever heard a song use anesthetize, the lyric. But there's a line in it, "You're only inches on a reel to reel." In other words, it's a product. It's a product. Like, the next big single to come out of a band from Liverpool or Manchester it's cannon fodder. It's here today, gone tomorrow, and that there wasn't the care that there would have been in the 60s. Frank Zappa used to talk about that they were better off with the cigar chomping record executives who would listen to a record like My Aim Is True and say, I don't get it, but the kids seem to like it. Let's make thousands of it.
Yeah.
And that's I think what we're missing today in the business is there's like oversaturation where you've got people making bedroom records. Some of it is brutal. Some of it has quality. The only way that you can ever get from being brutal to quality is where there's a management and a record label and resources that kind of allow you to grow and to educate yourself as a musician to the point where, like, most people's first record, if you think like Bob Dylan's first record is quite throwaway, you know, I mean, and when you think of Bob Dylan, you know, like the canon of work that's there.
Yeah.
But the first record that comes out isn't always the shining jewel in the crown.
Yeah.
And so
it's a very
I
rare
feel like
case that the like a band's first album is best ever. Like say Guns N' Roses, like their first album is a absolute banger, I suppose you could say. But yeah, hard to follow up.
Well, like Appetite for Destruction, like because they would have had experience being in two bands. Was it Hollywood Rose?
Hollywood Rose
and
LA Guns, I think it was.
Okay, so when they came together, they would have been refined enough that you can
I guess you
separate the chaff from the wheat.
Point,
Like Appetite for Destruction, Welcome to the Jungle. Is My Michelle on Appetite for Destruction?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. It's so
Paradise
easy. Is it
City,
so easy?
So
Paradise
easy.
City.
Mr. Brownstone.
I Used to Love Her.
I don't know if that's on that. Maybe it's a later.
You sure? You Used to Love Her? No.
That's the Saw Doctors though as well, isn't it?
Do they do it too?
Well, they do their own version, their own song.
Or do they? But anyway, like it's Rocket Queen. Is Rocket Queen on it?
That's on it.
Okay. Yeah. So like they're all classics in the making, but Appetite for Destruction in a lot of ways was like a third album disguised as the first album. I always felt,
okay.
You know,
that's a good point. I hadn't thought of it that way. Yeah.
Personally, I just feel like they've gone through enough cycles of the band that they refined it to like, okay, this doesn't work, this definitely works. And as you know yourself, playing live is really where you find out what songs work and what don't.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, My Aim Is True is a cracking first album, but everything that follows, like This Year's Model, Armed Forces, like none of it feels like leftovers from the first record. Everything feels like it's ground up all the time. And that's like, certainly with the first few records, which I much prefer his later material, but you can feel like he's blossoming all the time, certainly as a writer anyway.
That's it, yeah. And yeah, even just going back to the Saturday Night Live thing, they basically banned him from coming back on again after he changed the song on the fly. But yeah, you mentioned the Attractions earlier on. Are they on the Aim Is True album? They were his backing band on that, which was Bruce Thomas, Steve Neve, and Pete Thomas. And they were the original. They were the Attractions. That's
so
the correct way of it.
I think, I could have this wrong, that they're not on My Aim Is True, but they're on the next record. Because like initially it's an Elvis Costello album. What I think of it in my head is if you go to Spotify now, My Aim Is True is in the Elvis Costello section, but Elvis Costello and the Attractions is a different section altogether.
Just reading on my notes here. So This Year's Model was his second album that was his first with the Attractions.
Yeah, that's right.
So it was, it says here, a raw, harder rocking record than My Aim Is True. And of course, like Elvis Costello, he doesn't stick to one particular genre throughout his career. He's gone off to many, many different genres. So he comes out with a third album, Armed Forces, which was in 79. From that then was the big hit Oliver's Army. And this is actually a song that I'd heard, throughout the years, but I didn't know it was Elvis Costello. Because I don't think I mentioned at the start that I didn't really know a hell of a lot about Elvis Costello coming into this. And, on this podcast, the guest always chooses. So you happen to choose him and say, okay, cool, I'll learn about him. We'll talk about him. But as I start listening to his music, I know that song. Oh, I know that song. And Alison and No Flag and Pump It Up and Oliver's Army. And watching The Detectives, like, I know all these songs. I just didn't know it was him. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's, he's very, his songs kind of permeated throughout culture, that I was aware of as I was growing up without me even being aware of it at the same time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So he did Oliver's Army, which was very peaked at number 2 in Britain, and it's a big song to this day still. Anyway, so he went on to produce a self-titled album by the Specials, which was leader of a ska revival movement at the time, and so you see a lot of you see a bit more of kind of ska and reggae stuff kind of comes into his later stuff as well. So in February of 1980, he had a soul-influenced "Get Happy," which was another one. And are you familiar with this album yourself? Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And so it peaked at number 2 in Britain and number 11 in America. So he started charting in America. The first few albums didn't really make any sort of a wave. But yeah, he went on to release... Costello and the Attractions released Trust in 81, which was his 5th album, produced by a guy called Lowe. Yes, that's the one.
Yeah.
So this could easily descend into me listing off his albums because he's had as far as I can tell, it's like 31 studio albums and various mini live and collaboration albums and so on. But I suppose what are the albums that kind of stand out to you of all those 31 albums? I'm sure you haven't listened to every single one of them, or maybe you have. What do you think?
Most of them, and then if not, bits and pieces on others. But like the early records, not that I didn't love them, that kind of came a little bit later. I came to Elvis Costello through conversations that I had with Ian Birmingham. And people will know Ian Birmingham he was the lead singer of the Eskies. He now goes by Old Sea Legs. An amazing, amazing songwriter in his own right, and personally had a profound effect on me as a musician and as a writer, and what a writer could or was supposed to be. And we talk about, he'd say, "Do you like Tom Waits?" And I'd say, "I've never heard Tom Waits." And he said, "Okay, go check out Martha, like these different songs of his." He got me really interested in Bob Dylan. And at one point, it's going to sound crazy, I remember on Bebo, the old
Bebo.
Before Facebook, you had like your section of likes and dislikes.
Yeah.
And he had like music he liked, and Elvis Costello and the Attractions came up. And because he liked them, I thought, well, they must be worth checking out. And initially, when I heard things like Alison, Angels Want to Wear My Red Shoes, or I Don't Want to Go to Chelsea, like I liked it. But it was against the backdrop of what was like kind of a post-punk band sound, which just wasn't what I was into at the time. But when I heard albums like King of America and Spike and Mighty Like a Rose, which are kind of later, that's like late 80s, early 90s. King of America in particular. But just before that was an album called Punch the Clock, which is kind of like it's his most 80s record. Like it's got songs like Every Day I Write the Book, Let Them All Talk, Shipbuilding, which, I mean, like, I just think it's one of his most breathtaking ballads. But for me, like, my number one of all his records is King of America, because it's very much, and if you haven't heard it, you'd love this, because I know kind of music you like. But he also has another record called Almost Blue, and that's just end-to-end country covers, but they're like unusual ones. Like there's Hank Williams covers and
it's going to get to that country inspired album, all right.
Tonight the Bottle Let Me Down by Merle Haggard and stuff that, and
Hank Williams and as well, and
and it has Good Year for the Roses, which is the big single from that, which I know George Jones did a version of. I think it's a Billy Sherrill song. I think, but no, Billy Sherrill was the producer.
Yeah.
Who wrote?
He actually did. I think it was 1972. I think, or maybe not sure the exact year now. But he did go to Nashville, and he started. He had like a few writing sessions with George Jones, who was actually one of the husbands of Tammy Wynette, which was the topic of my first episode. But they did the song "Stranger in the House." That was the name of the song, And he actually got to, I think they wrote the song together, but then he actually got up on stage and sang with them a few times as well.
Wow.
And there was actually a point where, in just keeping on the country theme, I suppose, in 1989, Costello was asked to perform at the Royal Albert Hall with Johnny Cash and June Carter Cash, who were Nick Lowe's, who was the producer you mentioned, who were his parents-in-law at the time. So apparently during the performance of a Christian hymn, Will the Circle Be Unbroken, June threw to Costello to sing the next verse, but he admitted that he'd already performed all the verses he knew. So she just got, I'll just make one up. And he did. It was like, turned out really good. So geez, he was on stage playing with Johnny Cash and June Carter. That's some, thing to have under your belt, isn't it?
Amazing. And that was him all over. Like you mentioned about how he would jump from genre to genre. He had like a great working relationship with Chet Baker toward the end of his life. And like you're talking about a mainstay of jazz. The country elements to what he did. He produced Rum Sodomy and the Lash by the Pogues as well.
Right.
He ended up, he was married to Cotto Riordan, who was the bass player in the Pogues for quite a while.
This was, I think, 1985, I think, just before King in America.
Bang on. Yeah, yes. Bang on.
They were actually called Pogue Mahone first.
Yeah.
Pogues. Then they went on to be called the Pogues.
Yeah, the Brits got word of what that meant. Yeah,
oh God, you couldn't have that.
No, you could not.
But yeah, he went on to King of America, which I'm going to have to dive into now. It didn't come up in my Spotify exploration of Elvis Costello, but because obviously 31 albums, it's like where to start. But I start with the hits, I suppose you could say, so I knew what to come into. But
and there isn't a hit on that. And like I did a little bit of homework for this podcast, and anybody who does a review of like his top 27 albums or whatever, King of America is like way, way at the bottom, which I can't understand, because for me, of a collection of songs, it's just like it's cream of the crop as far as I'm concerned.
Probably,
and the fact that you're into country music, I guarantee there'll be at least 3 songs that you're going to want to cover off that record.
It could be, yeah.
I promise you.
I say that's because it's country that it's so low on the list, because I suppose isn't he I suppose the genre he's defined that is new age. Is that technically the name of the genre that he's kind of, I suppose, isn't best known for, I suppose.
The early part of his career, certainly, yeah. Like the Alison, I don't want to go to Chelsea, pump it up type stuff, yeah.
So how would you define new age? So I know there's a few like new age of British heavy metal and all this kind of stuff I know through my listening past, but new age itself is kind of a new thing to me, I suppose. How would you describe new age?
No bands like Flock of Seagulls. I like everything after punk, somewhere between 78 and 82. So like Gary Newman, things like Cars. Okay. So before you could call that, like, I don't know what we call that today, some kind of dance music. You could dance to it, but it's like indie music today, but with more quiffed hair, and you could kind of, dance to it like that.
Yeah.
That's my interpretation of it. Like, it's got all the energy of punk, but it's not with indie fashion, really, is the way I would think of it. Like Tears for Fears to me, or like New Order, that kind of stuff falls into that.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Okay. I may look into it more, because it's a kind of an area of music that I know very little about.
I don't either, but that's just my interpretation of it. You know what I mean?
And that's the best thing about doing this podcast, is to start learning about all these people I don't necessarily know all that much about, and listen to all this music that I hadn't just taken the time to listen to in the past. And
for sure.
And same with the listener listening now, they probably haven't heard a lot about Elvis Costello in the past, and here we are learning about him together. So
absolutely.
But yeah, after the King of America, he did the Blood and Chocolate album, which was a reunion with the Attractions and producer Nick Lowe. But this was the last record he did with the Attractions until 94. And are you familiar with that? Blood and Chocolate?
Yeah.
Interesting title.
It's an interesting title. Of the records from that time, it's probably my least favorite, or least go-to. Like, I love anywhere where you feel the emphasis is on his songwriting and that it's not Elvis as part of a band, it's Elvis with band.
Okay.
It's just, I just think there's more attention paid to the songs, like Spike, which is 1989, and King of America 86, and then Mighty Like a Rose. Not as much, but I think of those as three. And I thought it always would have made a great trilogy, but Blood and Chocolate is there just after King of America. So if we're going to like get rid of that,
yeah,
and just put those three together, it would make a brilliant run of records.
That's it. I think it was after that Blood and Chocolate though in '87 that Costello. I'm to stop myself saying Costello. Negotiate new worldwide record contract with Warner Brothers, and he began his songwriting collaboration with Paul McCartney, which is, it's a fantastic opportunity for any songwriter out there. It's like, play with one of the Beatles and see how we get on. But I haven't gotten in notes here what songs he did with him written. But do you know much about that era of?
Yeah, so he started. McCartney had a record coming out called Flowers in the Dirt, and he'd approached a number of different people about the prospect of writing some songs together, and the name Elvis Costello was thrown out there. And Elvis, when he was younger, was actually the founder of a Beatles fan club, because I'm sure there was tons of them. And so you can just imagine like idolizing somebody. Imagine idolizing Johnny Cash and ending up writing songs with Johnny Cash. It's just so hard to comprehend. But the two of them worked together, and one of the big songs from that McCartney record was called My Brave Face.
Okay.
And the lyrics are just Costello all over. And I like that particular era McCartney, like post Wings, I wouldn't have been a huge fan of. I mean, I love Paul McCartney, but I loved anything he did with Costello. There was another song they did, which the demo of is just insane, called I Know That You Want Her To. And Costello has like a scream of a vocal on like what's quite a tender track. Amazing. But on Spike, there was a couple of collaborations too. There was a song called Pads, Paws and Claws, which is kind of a take on a 12-bar blues, but it's just exceptional. And Paul plays bass. Veronica, they wrote that together. And Paul plays bass on the opening track of Spike, which is called This Town. There's definitely something I'm leaving out. But they're like, I often find when you have two giants and they write together, it can be a little bit, it's like super groups. Like, you think of the Highwaymen. That's an exception. That's where
that's exceptions true.
Yeah, exactly. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, that works. There are some that don't have the fruitful outcomes that others would, but I just think the two of them together, I thought they were incredible.
Yeah, I find sometimes with like super groups, like you'd say in rock ones or different genres, you have these huge titans of their genre come together, 4 or 5 of them in the band, but then they tend to turn out this kind of generic kind of 4-chord, whoa, kind of whatever singing kind of stuff, and it's like, oh, okay, that wasn't that great. So he started collaborating with lots of different people then after this as well. He wrote an entire album for former Transvision vamp, say that 5 times fast, singer Wendy James, called Now Ain't the Time for Your Tears. Then he went on to reunite with the Attractions in '94 with the album Brutal Youth, which was apparently a more straightforward pop-oriented album that he had recorded since Goodbye Cruel World. I don't think we mentioned that one actually. Goodbye Cruel World was apparently a commercial and critical failure, which was 1984. I think it was a different style of music altogether, and people didn't really take to it. But they embarked anyway after Brutal Youth. They went on a worldwide tour in '94 and kept going through it 95. So he basically started collaborating with lots and lots of people. Most notably, Burt Bacharach, which was 1998. And so they actually did a few songs together, and they actually appeared, I don't know if you know this now, they both appeared together in an Austin Powers movie. I think it was the first one, The Spy Who Shagged Me. He was in that. The two of them were on a street while Austin was dancing around with, what's the one's name, the blonde one? I can't think of her name now, but
I know who you mean though.
Yeah. And they were playing, Burt Bacharach is sitting at like a grand, or kind of an upright piano sitting on the street, and there was Elvis Costello playing his guitar, and they were performing a song that they had written together.
It's Never Fall in Love Again. I'll Never fall in love again. Is that the song?
I think that's the one. Yeah, yeah.
I think, yeah.
And he did some songs for Notting Hill soundtrack as well, which was Julia Roberts and what's his name?
Hugh Grant.
Hugh Grant, that's the guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he did a few songs for a few different albums. So, and I think actually that reminds me now, I think the first time I ever heard of Elvis Costello was from The Simpsons. You remember this? He appeared in The Simpsons. I think Homer went to the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Fantasy.
Oh, yeah.
And Elvis had his own instrument shack and selling guitars or something or giving out the guitars to the guys. And I think at some point he ran out of guitars and he proposed that someone play bass, but no one wanted to play bass, so they started wrecking the place or something like that.
Yeah. He's made he was in Frasier as well.
Was he? Yeah.
Frasier, where he's in the coffee house, he's kind of playing the busker, and he's selling pirated copies of like The Who, and it's like he's like a lot of guys who were popular in the 70s and early 80s. I always find like whatever the next decade is that comes is the trickiest for them. And yet there's records like 91 was Mighty Like a Rose. 93 he did a record which is probably his most experimental, called the Juliet Letters. And it was with the Brodsky Quartet. So the only backing is these like 4-piece string arrangements. And it's very obscure. And it kind of, at the time, it was kind of written off as being a bit too highfalutin.
Oh, yeah.
Which it kind of is. Like a lot of the lyrics, like there's one, I almost had a weakness, where he says, "Thank you for the flowers, I threw them all in the fire." Thank you for the pictures. I've never seen such photographs of such ugly children. Like it's very weird. But it's actually one of my favorite records of his because it's such a bold, creative move. And like things like that today is what I feel is so missing from music, is people who are willing to take a complete creative leap. Like, and he uses this argument as well in the 1980s, where the audiences are so not used to hearing things like an upright bass and some simple drums or some smoky saxophone. They just expect that that's all that jazz is. And I would find it way more impressive today if you heard, when I say mainstream contemporary artists, I mean the artists that we know as being like top 15, top 20, taking a really bold leap, like doing a jazz record or doing something that's like inspired by the music of the 50s or the 40s or whatever. And they don't. And I don't know whether that's from a credibility perspective or a fear that it wouldn't sell or, whatever. But I found that artists who cling to whatever they feel would be mainstream popular age and date the fastest. It's you listen to groups like T'Pau and Kylie Minogue in the 80s, and their career is just, Kylie Minogue maybe not so much, but the groups like Aztec Camera, who just are just like everything, their look, their sound, their production qualities, songs are 80s through and through. And now they go on these like package tours with the likes of Fergal Sharkey and Nina and stuff like that, and do like an 80s package tour and Lamal, all this kind of stuff. I just feel that sort of dates the fastest. And what I love about Elvis is just that relentless experimentation. So Juliet Letters, that's another one that I recommend too.
Okay, very good. And so he keeps kind of reinventing himself in a way. I suppose skipping on a little bit, because there's just so much. I could be here listing stuff for hours. But I think at one point he got to 2001. He started working with his band, which were called The Attractions. Now they're called The Imposters, on the album When I Was Cruel. And I think it still had Pete Thomas and Steve Neve.
Steve Naive, yeah.
Naive, is Steve Naive? I
think so, yeah. I always get that wrong when I read it, but when I hear it, I know who it is.
Yeah. And I heard Elvis in an interview saying how the Imposters are technically, some of the same guys from the Attractions, but they're not the same band anymore. They've kind of, the Imposters have been going longer than the the attractions were going, and that they've evolved over the years and become a new band, I suppose, in a way.
Sure.
So now it's the Elvis Costello and the Imposters. And so When I Was Cruel was his album, and so it kicked off another productive era for him. In 2003, he'd had the album North, which was kind of classically styled pop songs. And then the next year, he collaborated with his new wife, Diana Krall.
Yeah.
I think that's actually his third wife, if I'm not mistaken. I could be mistaken on that.
You could be dead right. Yeah.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. And North is like a record. I think he had just split from Caught O'Riordan and was now with Diana Krall. And it's like the perfect, I think of it as like rainy night jazz, you know, just a record that you can throw on, let it go from end to end, and has a real, how would you put it? It's sentimental, but like it's brooding, and it's very obviously written by a man who, it's not someone in their 20s. It's not like an angst-ridden, moody record. It's very reflective and contemplative. And again, because it's later in his career, it gets very overlooked. But I think will be another one of my recommendations too.
Very good. So after this album, then The Girl in the Other Room with Diana Krall, he released two of his own original material, 2 albums, Il Sogno, classical work, and a concept album, The Delivery Man, which is a rock and roll record, which he cut with the Imposters. Then he went on in 2006 to release My Flame Burns Blue, which is a live album where he fronted a 52-piece jazz orchestra, the Metropole Orchestre, which was 52-piece jazz orchestra. That'd be some stage to helm, I suppose you could say. Fair play to him. And then, it keeps going on, more collaborations with Alan Toussaint, a R&B legend. And then Costo, he worked with T-Bone Burnett, which for a series of recording sessions was compiling to Secret Profane and Sugarcane, which released in 2009. And the pair also recorded a second album, National Ransom, which was 2010. Again, he's sort of hugely prolific. In 2011, Costello and the Imposters released The Return of the Spectacular Spinning Songbook, which was recorded live over a 2-day stint at Wiltern in Los Angeles. He just keeps going, and then in 2013 he started working with The Roots, the hip hop band, which I think they're on one of the late night TV shows. Is it
Jimmy Fallon's thing? I think they're Jimmy's band. Yeah.
So they're the kind of house band, I suppose. So he was working with them from 2013, and he started writing his memoirs then in 2015. And he had a compilation album, Unfaithful Music and Soundtrack album. He just keeps going. He's just like, it's like had Neil Young. We're talking about Neil Young on one of the earlier episodes as well. And he had like 40 albums, like every year, bang, bang, bang.
Yeah.
It's like, how could you, obviously, you'd love to be as prolific and as productive as that. But I say you nearly are. You after writing nearly 60 songs with Charlie getting over the course of the lockdown.
Well, like the funny thing is, unless they're being released as quickly as they're being written, a lot of times things get forgotten about. And when you look back on someone's career, I think what's most impressive is this was the amount of content he was releasing. Think of all the stuff that got made and that never got released.
Never saw the light of day. Yeah.
Absolutely. And what's weird is like the Beatles don't have a huge back catalogue because everything that they wrote, they released. Okay. It was kind of on a need to do basis. So like we need a new single, write one. It wasn't like here's an option of 15. Paul McCartney used to talk about they would go into Abbey Road early in the morning, break for lunch, have a little ciggy break, and then back into the studio. And they would like do half of an album in a whole day.
Yeah.
And I think that work ethic now is like, if you watch, especially on Instagram, you hear people talk about they could have an album in the work for 2 years and then it comes out. And I personally feel, I don't know if you'd be the same, I get sick of it after a week. So I nearly do it all in the one time and then just stick it out.
I wish because I've my second album kind of in the work for the last 2 years, but I work a day job and all this kind of stuff. It's not, if it was full time at it,
no,
it'd be a different story. Yeah. Absolutely, But at the same time, I'm sick of these songs. I just want to do new stuff.
I know it's tough.
That's the thing. You have to keep them, write them and get them out, write them and get them out.
If you can, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, which is actually kind of what I did there recently. I did my own little acoustic EP where I just did some covers, and I did release a new song as well, original song. I just recorded it in the weekend. I threw it out there. It's like, done, get it out there. It's like, okay, phew. So
that's the thing.
So it went on in July of 2018. Elvis revealed that he was recovering from a small but very aggressive cancer. But the thing is, by the time he actually delivered this news, he was not only on the mend, we had a new album with the Imposters in the can and ready to be released. Man, this guy never stops. But yeah, he seems to be happy and healthy there now at the moment. Anyway, he's living over in Vancouver, and he's been working on some stuff. I think he actually released Look Now, which was the album, in 2018, but then he went on to release Hey Clockface in 2020, and it was his first album credited to Elvis Costello as a solo act in 10 years. So are you familiar with these two albums, Look Now and Hey Clockface?
Yeah. I mean, I find that a lot of stuff post 2008 sometimes feels like the next record is like leftovers from the one that preceded it.
Okay.
Which, like, that's typical of a lot of the older guys. Like Dylan has been accused of similar stuff where there's a trio like Time Out of Mind, Love and Theft, and Modern Times, and there's some people who would say a lot of the songs just feel like they're whatever was left on the cutting room floor from the previous record. But I find with Elvis, what's always most interesting is that you don't know what the next record is going to be like. There's like with Willie Nelson, and I love Willie Nelson, but the last great record I think Willie brought out was in '96 called Spirit, which he wrote all the songs with his sister Bobby. And after that, it's kind of like he'll take a selection of well-known country songs and do his version.
Yeah.
And you kind of know what you're going to get. Like he actually did a gorgeous version of Guy Clark's song, but 3 years ago. It's called My Favorite Picture of You.
Okay, yeah.
And I think his version is absolutely stunning. And he does beautiful versions of stuff, but you kind of know what the next Willie Nelson record is going to sound like. With Elvis, he would come out of Mighty Like a Rose and do the Juliet Letters, and you felt like you were listening to a completely different artist. And then on from that, Brutal Youth or Painted from Memory with Burt Bacharach. And like, that's not everybody's cup of tea. Some people like to know what they're getting from a Merle Haggard record or a Guns N' Roses record or whatever. But I like artists that challenge the listener a little bit. And I'm probably alone in that category, but he never fails to. And he did it a couple of years ago in Dublin, actually. He did a string of gigs in the Olympia. First night was just him. Second night was him with a jazz band. Third night was him with a full rock band. So no night was the same. And like, granted, you'd have to have the budget to do it, but I love artists who do that.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to, bands, they have to evolve and develop, or else they'll just get stale, and they'll hate performing the songs because they're not performing anything new and challenging to themselves. And hopefully the band would hope that the audience would kind of come along with them and say, oh yeah, you like our new stuff, cool, and keep going and develop more stuff. But it's a fine line to balance on for a lot of bands as well, isn't it?
Well, there's the old, and this is why I think pop music, for me, I just, like, I don't, whatever you would consider contemporary pop music just doesn't appeal to me, because I think it comes back to whatever the tried and true formula is. So, and again, you can take a look at whatever you consider to be contemporary Irish pop music at the moment. We won't get into naming names, but like, there's a lot of stuff that just sounds like this is a new version of whatever. Yeah. Like, let's say, oh, this is the Irish equivalent of Ed Sheeran. This is the female equivalent, or this is the male or female equivalent to Florence and the Machine. This is, and it just sounds like stuff that I've already heard. And but what I think leaves a real hole in the marketplace is if you do something that people wouldn't be used to. Like, if there's an amazing artist from California called Laufey, and it's spelled, her name is spelled Laufey, and she does like reworks of 1950s jazz pieces, but her own music sounds like that too. And when you hear it, it stops you in your tracks because you're like, what is this? And she's only like 21 or 22. But the music is so captivating. And she has these reels on Instagram. I'll just keep, I've spent, I swear to God, I've spent an hour just flicking, watching her renditions of things like In a Sentimental Mood, My Funny Valentine, and then some of her own tunes as well. And it's just, that to me really stands out. Now, again, jazz, contemporary jazz isn't going to be everybody's cup of tea. But when you do something well that isn't mainstream, you open up the opportunity to actually reach an audience of people who are like, I wouldn't usually listen to a blues record, but this is really, really good. John Mayer did it with Continuum, where when was the last contemporary blues record that you can think of that broke the American top 15? And he did it, so it can be done.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I suppose it's going on to his most recent project, which was a kind of a revisit to this year's model, one of his earlier albums. He decided to take the music from those master tapes, which were the original attractions where we were playing the music, but he had added Spanish language vocals by contemporary Latino musicians such as Juanes. And so the Spanish model, as it's now called, is actually just after dropping, I think it was 2 weeks ago. So that was like this most recent project. But he's still going strong. He doesn't look like he's going to stop anytime soon. And
like, who would even think of doing that? Who would think of taking an old record and having the lyrics reworked in another language? And that's what I mean. And there's going to be a lot of young musicians listening to this podcast, and that's one thing that I try to drill into. I'm 29 now, and I meet musicians who are like 19, 20, 21, and I'm like, I don't believe, and again, this is just me, you think of young bands who you meet, and they're like, they want to be, Emily Seven is a great example of just a real, balls to the wall, great young punk band. And they're on an English tour at the moment, and they're going to find success in whatever way, shape, or form they want it. I don't know any young musicians who heard a Julio Iglesias record and thought, you know what, that's what I want to do. It's always what I would refer to as like genuine, real creative music, like the Elvis Costellos, Bob Dylan's, for rock bands, Guns N' Roses. It's never like, who do you know that like, oh, my biggest influences like Britney Spears, Beyonce, Christina Aguilera? Never. It's never stuff like that. The stuff that comes out is like, you have 5 or 6 friends who look like they should be Abercrombie and Fitch models, and they can kind of sing, and they go on the X Factor. And that to me is a different world. It's not music. It's like the conveyor belt of Hollister models who
it's like they want to be a pop star, but not like write music. You know what I mean? They just want to be the singer and get the accolades, but not actually have any artistic merit, let's say.
Stephen Stills used to say, there's the Monkees and there's the Beatles. It's like you can take a 4-piece group or 5-piece group, and when you strip away the integrity, what are you left with? And that to me, like, look, again, I don't want to get off for saying that boy bands or girl bands don't have integrity. That's not what I'm saying. Everything has its place. But I just feel like the musicians that you meet who really love music and are interested in writing songs of a certain caliber will always mention names like the Beatles. Like, it's been going on now for 60 years. Mention the Beatles, the Bob Dylans, the Leonard Cohens, Tom Waits, Elvis Costello. These names come up again and again and again and again.
Yeah.
And when you look at anyone who's making, like in the last couple of years, I'd say one of the most alternative records was Hosier's record. Listen to his influence: gospel, country, R&B, not the pop throwbacks like NSYNC.
Yeah, that's true.
You know what I mean? Like, again, and I'm going to get off for saying this kind of stuff, but there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm just saying the stuff that lasts from a creative perspective is always the stuff that leaves whatever the sheeny pop stuff of the time is at the door and gets down with the nitty-gritty of genuine creative endeavor.
Exactly. Yeah. That's it. And I suppose that brings us to end of our episode on Elvis Costello. Hopefully you know, if there's a mad Elvis Costello fan that's listening to us that are mad at us now for leaving out something, I do apologize, but you know, we can only do so much, I suppose. But again, Colm, where would you like to people to go and follow you and listen to your music? Where can they find you?
So Instagram, Colm Gavin, and Facebook, Colm Gavin Music, are probably the two places where I post the most regularly. Whether it's snippets of concerts or I hope to have some more new material out soon. And if you have Spotify or iTunes or any of the places, the good streaming platforms, you can listen to the 1992 tapes, which is my latest EP, which there will be physical copies of soon.
Yes.
So keep an eye on Instagram and Facebook, Colm Gavin Music and Colm Gavin, for updates and all that kind of stuff.
Very good, very good. And of course, at this point, if you want to follow the podcast, go over to our Instagram, Facebook, it's Copper's Corner Podcast. And also, if you want to help support the show, keep the fires are burning and the wheels are turning, as I like to say, if you can go over to patreon.com / the Copper's Corner Podcast. I nearly said my other podcast, The Art Saddle. There's another podcast I have, by the way.
Check that one out too, though. Yeah.
I'm sure we'll get Colm on that podcast there soon enough as well. Yeah, thanks very much, Colm, for coming on, and
sure.
And I suppose introducing me to the world of Elvis Costello. As I said, I'd known of him, but didn't really know anything about him. So now I wouldn't call myself an expert at all, but I know a bit more about him at this stage, and I do appreciate his music a lot more now as well. I definitely will be diving deeper into it and trying to get out what you're getting out from it. You know what I mean? And hopefully that'll help. Maybe influence some of my music as well. Fingers crossed.
You check out Almost Blue. Well, so if I was to give like my top 5 recommendations to anybody, but in particular, you take note of these two. Spike from 1989, which is Spike the Beloved Entertainer. Mighty Like a Rose, King of America, Almost Blue. I suppose you kind of have to check out his debut record, My Aim Is True. But there's one that you mentioned with Alan Toussaint, The River in Reverse, which is brilliant. And the Juliet Letters, which is kind of like my experimental throw in.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely. I'll have to check out, especially the King of America one, the country one. I'll definitely have to check that.
I promise you, your listeners can take note of this. You will end up covering one of the tunes from that record because it's totally up your street. I love it.
Brilliant. Thanks very much again for coming on, and hope you enjoyed yourself. And hopefully we get you on in the future on the Art Saddle podcast, or even maybe back on this. I'm
sorry for all the technical glitches that none of you will see or hear, but that's why you've paused. So thanks, Copper, for your patience.
No problem at all. And thanks very much to the listener if you got this far in the episode. Thanks very much. And if you like the show, if you want to help us get the word out there, tell your friends about the show, share on social media. If you are on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, as it's called nowadays, please leave a review, a 5-star review if you can. Say something nice, that really helps out, get the word out and get hopefully more listeners to the podcast, and we develop a nice little community here and get some good stuff going. But I think we leave it there, Colm. Again, thanks very much. And if you want to say goodbye to our lovely listeners.
Well, look, it was a pleasure. And thank you so much to everybody if you've listened up to this point as well. And Copper, thanks so much to you, brother. It's a pleasure to chat.
As always, great to chat to you again. But yeah, we hopefully see you, lovely listener, again next week. Who knows what we'll be chatting about? We'll be chatting about something good anyway. But thanks very much. We'll talk to you next week.